Can you guys hear me now? Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm Amy Shallcross. I'm with the Delaware River Basin Commission, and I'm the manager of water resource operations. And we provide the technical support to the decree parties for any analyses that they need. Particularly, you may have heard of the planning support tool, and we run that for, we simulate different programs for them to make decisions. So the first thing I'm going to just say is just a few facts about the Delaware River Basin. You probably know them, but from one of the Supreme Court cases, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the statements in the decree was, "A river is more than an amenity, it is a treasure," and I'm sure everyone on this conference feels that way. So the main stem of the Delaware from Hancock to the mouth of the bay is 330 miles long. And the Delaware River forms an interstate boundary between Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware over its entire length. It drains about 13,500 square miles, and it provides water to 13.3 million people. That's about 5% of the United States population. From the basin, more than 6.4 billion gallons a day are withdrawn and used, and some of it is returned back. And there are significant exports to New York City, which can take up to 800 MGD, but normally they take between like 480 and 600. It depends on the year and how wet it is. And then New Jersey can take up to 100. Usually they're around 90. The river is the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi. Now there are dams on tributaries, but not on the main stem. And it contributes over 21 billion gallons in economic value. It's probably much more than that since the study that found that has been conducted. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of the flexible flow management program. And so you may have heard there were two Supreme Court decrees in 1931 and 1954. And that was because New York City had the foresight as early as 1905 to realize that they were going to need water to support their population. And so they were building reservoirs. On the picture on the right is Papactum Reservoir. And New Jersey was concerned that there would not be enough water coming down the river for them, and Pennsylvania as well. So then in 1961, you had the Delaware River Basin Commission and the DRB Water Code. It's the Delaware River Basin Water Code, not the DRBC Water Code. And then there's something called the Good Faith Agreement, and that's where the decree parties made some decisions for a slight modification to the decree, and they facilitated that through the Delaware River Basin Commission. Then we'll talk about the conservation release dockets and how the experimental fisheries program evolved over time. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the FFMP performance goals, and there are DRBC prepares FFMP implementation reports, performance reports, and that's the link to the website where those reports are located. We'll talk about them in a minute. Oops, let's see. Do I have the same? Oops. So just a little bit about the Supreme Court decree. The Supreme Court decree is based on riparian law, not prior appropriation like out west. One of the things was New York City needed to make releases to meet 1750 CFS at Trenton, at Montague, but the flow objective at Trenton was not in the decree. New York City was supposed to develop treatment of wastewater at Port Jervis, and that was to make sure that if not enough water was flowing downstream, at least high quality water would be coming downstream. There was authorization of New York City's diversion 800 MGD out of the basin when the 3 reservoirs were completed, and they needed to release water that they were sort of not using for water supply. And then New Jersey was allowed to take 100 million gallons a day out of the basin. The Office of the River Master was established, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were granted access to make inspections of the New York City system. The commission, 1961, it was established by a federal state compact, and the intent was to have an agency to do, manage the basin based on the watershed. So we can plan and coordinate the basin water resources. And then the concerns were water supply shortages, and it provided a venue for cooperation and for negotiation for water supply. There's also devastating flooding and severe pollution on the main stem and major tributaries. And so that kind of, feeds into that Port Jervis wastewater treatment. Now, the commission is only authorized to change provisions of the decree if the decree parties agree unanimously to those changes. And that's how the drought management program came into place, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then DRBC itself is required to cooperate and collaborate with state and federal agencies and not do redundant work. So just a clarification between DRBC and the decree parties. DRBC is the 4 states and the federal government. The federal government, even though the president is a representative, that was delegated to the Army Corps of Engineers, and primarily because of the reservoirs in the basin. But the decree parties are the 4 states and New York City. So the decree is the decree parties. The Supreme Court established the decree parties, and it did actually take an act of Congress to create the DRBC. And the picture on the upper left is President Kennedy and 4 governments signing onto the compact. There was legislation in each of the 4 states and in the federal government. So just a little bit about coordination between the DRBC and the decree parties. During the drought of record, the decree parties got together with the commission. Actually, this is, I think, with an emergency order, and the commission had conservation orders, and they actually reduced the Montague flow objective as well as the diversions out of basin by New York City and New York. And that was sort of became a little bit of the foundation for something called the Good Faith Agreement. As I mentioned, we work with the decree parties to provide technical information to help them with their negotiations on flow management. And the way we get stakeholder impact is through the Regulated Flow Advisory Committee, formerly known as the Flow Management Technical Advisory Committee, and also SEP, which is a subcommittee on ecological flows to RFAC. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was something called the Level B study performed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and DRBC ran the stakeholder involvement as well as other studies. And they came up with something called the Good Faith Agreement. And the Good Faith Agreement was an agreement by the decree parties. It was actually also an agreement to action by the Delaware River Basin. So that was the unanimous consent for a drought management program and experimental conservation releases. So the drought management program is phased reductions in the out of basin diversion by New York and New Jersey based on the reservoir storage. There were phased reductions and the establishment of the Trenton flow objective. And then there are, basically those are part of the drought management plans. And there is a basin-wide and a lower basin drought management plan. And that is so that the upper basin does not have to reduce the conservation releases if the lower basin is in a drought. And that actually kind of happened in 2010, where the lower basin went into a lower basin drought and the upper basin was still normal. A lower basin drought is defined on storage in 2 lower basin reservoirs. And then there was also a conservation program. And then the experimental fisheries program was sort of memorialized in part of the Good Faith Agree. It became a docket D77 CP, and that's related to New York State approached the commission with New York City to have sort of some kind of memorialization of the fisheries release program. And that is called D7720 CP, also known as Rev 1. So, let's see. So these are the operational plans that have developed since the beginning. So early in the 1950s, when the reservoirs were being constructed, there was really no plan. And then you had the decree, which was pretty much in place from 1954 to the late 1970s. Then you had D7720 CP. That was in place until about 1983. And then you had revision 1. And then it steps up all the way. Revision 4 was considered a major change to the experimental fisheries releases program. And then you had Rev 7. And then with the flooding, you had the addition of flood mitigation releases based on the floods of 2004, 5, and 6. So from the late 1970s until 2007, I believe, basically the reservoir operations, particularly the conservation releases, were sort of memorialized or run based on D77 20 CP Rev 1. And then in 2007, after much negotiation, there was the flexible flow management program. The first program was 4 years, and it went from 2007 to 2011. And then there were interim programs all the way from 2011 to 2016. And then in 2017, there was a program that began. It was FFMP 2017, obviously, and that's what you're operating under at the moment. Actually, I think that was 2017, and then we're continuing through here through 2028. I'm sorry, my little red bar is off here. So, and then other things that have come about was F.E. Walter Recreation Program that basically greatly helps releases for Trenton. And then you have F.E. Walter Drought Management Program that was established in the 1980s. And these blue things up here are when all of the reservoirs were completed in the basin. So related to the conservation releases, originally they were minuscule in the beginning. I think there was one, Never Sink was 3 CFS. Now they did change somewhat seasonally, but they were very, very small. Then, as I mentioned, New York State, New York City came to the commission and said, can we do something with conservation releases? So we had that docket. A docket is like a permit. And there were 3 major revisions to the program. Revision 1, which is the actual default program. It's incorporated into the comprehensive plan. That's a whole nother presentation. Revision 4 and revision 7, and basically there were base conservation releases, which was kind of like that 5 CFS, and then augmented conservation releases when the storage was normal, and that defined and D720 and the good faith agreement is where there was a delineation between normal and drought storage. And then in 2017, you had the flexible flow management program, and it had more enhanced releases for fisheries. They were much greater than Rev 1. The releases currently are based on the Joint Fisheries White Paper, which was developed between New York DEC and Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. And there are also banks for thermal mitigation and rapid flow change. The flexible flow management program is considered adaptive management and essentially converts potentially spilled water into managed water. And basically what that means is the conservation releases are based on forecast available water. And Jen's going to talk about how they go about figuring that out. So the performance goals of the FFMP are to manage droughts, to maintain the flow objectives at the highest level, to provide enhanced conservation releases, which is known as the Habitat Protection Program, maintain the desirable tailwater temperatures, and then minimize spills using the conditional seasonal store objective. And I'm going to only talk about these 2 in bold, the conservation releases and the tailwater temperatures, but Brennan and Peter are going to give you a much more detailed presentation on that. So these are the habitat protection goals of the FFMP, and you can see portions of the river are delineated by these colors, and above, in blue is where you have excellent protection. Green is good, and then yellow is moderate and minimal. I think this part here, this yellow part here is primarily related to the water coming in from the beaver kill, which is sort of warm and not always successful in combating that. But the excellent goal is basically to maintain the summer water temperatures of less than 20 degrees, and then only have rare exceedances where temperature is greater than 24 degrees C. And so basically the conservation releases based on the Joint Fisheries White Paper were intended to be much higher and actually decrease the temperature in the river. And so here I just put the volume of conservation releases 2017 versus Rev 1. And basically I told you that the conservation releases in Rev 1 were somewhat draconian. And so basically, in 2021, the conservation releases from the FFMP 17 tables were 6 times greater than Rev 1, From Pepacton, they were 4 times greater, and from Neversink, they were almost 2 times greater. And these are just the conservation releases from the tables. It doesn't include the conservation releases from the thermal bank or releases made to meet Montague. So real quickly, this is the temperature at Lordville over the past since June 1st to yesterday. And then you can see that there were only 2, maybe a minor exceedance of 24 degrees C. And then, so I just wanted to mention that on the DRBC website, we have compiled information for the upper basin. And basically here on the left shows you the zone of the temperature over from the day before, from yesterday. And then we have a 6-day range of temperature, and the tiny or the oldest measurements are these really pale tiny dots. And then the most recent measurements are these like dark purple dots. Also on these graphs are where the delineation between the warm water fishery and the cold water fishery and the sort of like the temperature goals. And then on the right is just a 6-day time series of temperature at different locations. And so in brief summary, basically the FFMP has been developed over 60 years, running from the decree to the current FFMP. Some aspects of conservation releases have been developed through the Water Code and the Good Faith Agreement. That's sort of really where it started as experimental fisheries programs. And the Flexible Flow Management Program is considered an adaptive management program for conservation releases. When there's more water, there is more water release for fish. And the conservation releases are much greater than they have been in the past. There are banks for thermal mitigation and rapid flow change. That's like the yo-yo effect, where you're converting from no directed releases to those are releases to meet Montague at 1750 to the conservation release tables when they're lower. And then basically for the conservation releases, we've gotten input through RFAC and the Subcommittee on Ecological Flows. And then DRBC basically summarized the performance of FFMP on our website, and I'll add that link here. It was earlier in the presentation. And so that is the rapid, brief history of the FFMP, because I wanted to give as much time to Jen and Brennan to give you the information that they have for you today. So I guess we're doing questions at the end, so I will stop sharing.
Jump right into the next presenter, which is Jen Garigliano. She is the Chief of Staff with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, the Bureau of Water Supply. She is on the front lines of all of the decisions that affect the reservoirs, both the diversions to New York City for water supply, and also the releases below the dams to the wild trout fishery and below. So Jen, thank you